So over to you, Craig, to talk about the life of Gwenwynwyn ab Owain Cyfeiliog, Prince of Powys, Prince, Lord or Vassal.
So I'm going to start with a brief anecdote from Gwenwynwyn's contemporary, Gerald of Wales, who related in one of his writings a story of how Gwenwynwyn's horse one day promptly trod on his foot, causing him lameness and weakness, a result, as Gerald had it, of the vengeance of heaven for his transgressions against Gerald, or more particularly his lack of faith or lack of any substantial support for Gerald's campaign, his long-running campaign to have St. David's recognized as a metropolitan see. We'll return to Gerald in just a moment and his assessment of Gwenwynwyn, but for now, it suffices for us to point out that Gerald, in his autobiography, refers to Gwenwynwyn as Prince of Powys and Cyfeiliog. So here is the passage in question. On a certain day, about the same time, Gwenwynwyn, Prince of Powys and Cyfeiliog, having summoned his nobles and the chief men of his country to sit with him in council, and mention being made of the labours of Geraldus, a common topic in those days, both in Wales and England, the prince himself thus spoke. Many a time and oft does our Wales stir great wars against England, but never has it waged one so great and grievous as that now fought in these our days by the elect of Manu, Gerald referring to himself, of course, who for the honour of Wales ceases not with long and pauseless efforts to vex and harass the king and the archbishop and all the clergy and people of England. In truth, if our wars last through the summer, they return to peace in the winter season, and never continue more than a year at most. But this man's warfare has already endured without cease for 5 years and more. How very strange it is to get words out of somebody's mouth from 800 years ago. Direct quotes don't always survive. The sheen is taken off that one only a little bit by the fact that Gwenwynwyn probably didn't say it. Gerald was an unabashed self-promoter, and it comes as no surprise to find his autobiography in particular littered with quotations from important personages who happen to agree precisely with his point of view. And for those of you who are staring at the title of my lecture, thinking that I've preempted my own question by referring in it to Gwenwynwyn as a prince, the proof is there in Gerald's writings that Gwenwynwyn was engaged in something more than aggrandizement when he called himself a prince. And yet, at various times during his reign, it makes more sense to conceive of him as a lord or as a vassal, and the brief period at the very end of the 12th century and the beginning of the 13th century, during which Wales had not one but two princes vying for power, had ended. So what I propose to do today is to examine Gwenwynwyn's career from the perspective of his shifting status and fortunes as far as we can make them out. In this endeavour, we benefit hugely from the work of David Stevenson, who in his recent volume on Powys, Medieval Powys, Kingdom, Principality and Lordships, 1132-1293, devoted an entire chapter to the rehabilitation of a man whose frequent switches of position and allegiance were hitherto looked upon with scorn by earlier generations of Welsh historians. Like Dafydd ap Gruffudd many decades later, however, Gwenwynwyn may have been misunderstood. Sandwiched between the polities of Gwynedd on the one hand and England on the other, he found it hard to chart his own path, and in the end suffered from the accident of geography that placed Powys where it was just as grievously as any error of judgment we may discern in his political maneuverings. That is, in fact, the only, if I can refer to it as this, likeness that we have of Gwenwynwyn. 3 impressions of seals survive, all used apparently in a sort of 10 or 15 year period. You can see Sigil Gwenwynwyn de Cyfeiliog, the seal of Gwenwynwyn of around the side. That is a fairly conventional question seal, with just a hint of a coat of arms on the shield itself, which you can just about make out, a hint of a border around it. It would surprise us not at all to find Gwenwynwyn using coats of arms at this exceptionally early time in the history of heraldry. Around this time, as far as we know, only one other person in Wales was using them, and that would be his near neighbour and rival Llywelyn ap Iorwerth, of whom more later. We may appreciate more fully the issue of how Gwenwynwyn found himself between rival polities by looking at the map here. So as we can see, Powys was bound to the north and the west by the lands of Gwynedd, and along its eastern border by the territories of the Marcher lords. In times gone by, Powysian territory extended as far as Pengwern, usually identified with modern-day Shrewsbury, and indeed, before his death, Gwenwynwyn would once again see that town, albeit briefly, under Welsh control. But such a circumstance in the 13th century was highly exceptional. For most of his life, Powys was subject to frequent incursions and annexations of outlying lands by Gwynedd and on occasion to Haybarth in the west and various lords in the east. So what was his background? Well, it was an auspicious one. His great uncle, Madog ap Meredydd, was the first great ruler to emerge in Powys since Bleddyn ap Cynfyn 100 years earlier. He is described as Rex Powysensium, the king of the Powysians. We'll come back to that issue of the tension between the title king and the style prince in just a little while. But it is hard to underestimate Madog's importance in mid-12th century Wales. He disputed with arms the supremacy of Owain Gwynedd in the northwest, and he took advantage of the anarchy in England to arrogate land to himself in Shropshire, beginning an occupation of the Oswestry salient that lasted for perhaps 20 years. When he died in 1160, Powys promptly fell apart as his many sons competed among themselves for control of the nascent polity. Just for simplification reasons here, I haven't included them all on this tree, but perhaps one of the most impressive was Owain Brygyntyn. But Gwenwynwyn descended not from Madog, as it turns out, but from his brother, Griffith, whose son Owain Cyfeiliog succeeded in establishing himself in the moat of Cyfeiliog, whose power in southern Powys was almost completely uncontested until shortly before his death in 1197. He is another one of these Powysian figures to whom we ought to be paying more attention, one feels. He prospered by all accounts during his reign in southern Powys, and we do actually have a literary reference to him. I'm thinking of the romance of Fitzwarren, and here's the passage here. So this actually demonstrates his prowess in battle. I quote, "When Fulk saw Sir Joyce taken and led away, he spurred his horse, and with his lance he struck a knight who led him through the body. Then came Owain Cyfeiliog, a bold and fierce knight, and with a lance of ash he struck Fulk, and so he took to flight, and the others followed hard after him for 2 leagues and more. And when they could not come up with him, they turned back and seized all the lands which belonged to Fulk. And they took Guy Fitzcantelupe of Porkington, who was constable to Fulk, and put him in prison at Rhuddlan, and his 7 sons with him." So, of course, we ought to treat this with something of a grain of salt. The romance is far from a straightforward historical narrative, and we should be wary of using a literary text as a straight historical source. But it does say some interesting things about Owain Cyfeiliog, and not the least of which that he was considered a sufficiently important personage in 12th century Wales so as to achieve a place of prominence in the narrative relating to Fulk. So, what can we say about Gwenwynwyn and his early years? Well, he's first attested in the mid-1180s. There is a touch of uncertainty about that. A charter does exist, dated at Llywelyn in 1185. But Hugh Price has made the suggestion that this charter is spurious, that although it may be based on the charter that exists, the copy which has come down to us is faulty in several particulars. We are on firmer ground if we trace his first attestation to the Britiae, the Welsh chronicles, which do so much to illuminate our understanding of Welsh history in this period. And in 1187, the Brenhinedd the Saeson, puts Gwenwynwyn in the castle of Gwernavigyn, convincingly identified as Carreg Hotha. We'll come back to that in just a minute. But in any case, it is interesting to note that in these early years, Gwenwynwyn is very strongly associated with Cyfeiliog. We find him issuing charters in that comote. And as you saw when you looked at the seal a few minutes ago, he often referred to himself as Gwenwynwyn ab Owain of Cyfeiliog. So this would appear to imply that he exercised some sort of territorial jurisdiction in that area, even during the reign of his father. In fact, that is an interesting and open question. We see Gwenwynwyn taking far more of the reins, as it were, of power in the early 1190s. And it may be the fact that Owain Cyfeiliog's health was starting to fail him, and so Gwenwynwyn was beginning to act as a regent in all but name. In fact, Owain Cyfeiliog took the monastic habit in 1195. In 1196, we find Gwenwynwyn being attacked by Hubert Walter, the Archbishop of Canterbury, along with an army of Gwynedd. The siege was ultimately successful, although Gwenwynwyn retook the castle a little later. Dr. Stevenson has problematized the issue of the castle's location. There are several possible castle sites and mots in the vicinity of Welshpool, and these sources are rather difficult to interpret. But in any case, the important aspect of this for our purposes is that Gwenwynwyn held castles and was considered important enough to be attacked. The following year, he assumed control of southern Powys on the death of his father, Owain Cyfeiliog. And the year after that, we find him leading an assault at Paynes Castle, from which he was driven off on the 13th of August, if I remember rightly, by an Anglo-Norman army, with great loss of life to his own army. Strangely enough, this defeat, which would appear to be total and a rather abject defeat, seems to have harmed his reputation very little or none at all. And as R.R. Davies pointed out over 30 years ago, for the following few years, he exercised what we might, with justification, refer to as supremacy in Gwynedd, in that period before Llywelyn ab Iorwerth had fully come to power in Gwynedd. So let's take a look at some of the initiatives that he embarked upon during this period. The first thing to say is that he was very quick to bend to the King of England. We may postulate allegiance to Richard the Lionheart from the beginning of the 1190s onward. There are a few strands of evidence for this. We have in one source that he pledged not to attack the king's lands whilst he was on crusade. And there's also an interesting aspect to one of Gwenwynwyn's charters, which is that it is dated according to Richard the Lionheart's regnal year. This is almost unique occurrence in the Acts of Welsh rulers. It only happens on one other occasion, and that occasion is rather problematic because of the provenance of the document. And so this may speak to a willingness to prostrate himself, so to speak, before Richard. We find him annexing Arwystli in 1197, and indeed that becomes an important component of Gwenwynwyn's territory from that point onwards, such that he styles himself Lord of Arwystli on one occasion at the beginning of the 13th century. We'll hear more about that in just a moment. And once Richard the Lionheart died, we have relations with King John being established. I'm sorry, you may be having a slight issue with my microphone. I don't know what it is, but I'll continue. We find King John confirming Gwenwynwyn in his lands in 1199, and also ominously in any lands in Wales he was not yet in possession of. So he had something of a license to cause mischief. A similar agreements are arrived at with some of the minor rulers of Deheubarth at this time and others. So we may infer from this that King John was already seeing the danger that Llywelyn ab Iorwerth was posing to him in Gwynedd, and was seeking to establish a sort of buffer against a buffer in Powys and those other lands surrounding Gwynedd. In 1200, John granted him the manor of Ashford in Derbyshire, which Gwenwynwyn enjoyed intermittently for the remainder of his reign. And around this time, a marriage with Margaret Corbett of the prominent Marcher family was arranged and was smiled upon by John, again, probably for reasons of self-interest. By this time, Gwenwynwyn's exploits were well known. In spite of his reversal at Paynes Castle, he had gained a reputation as a formidable warlord and was able to amass substantial armies, as the praise poetry that describes his men arrayed with bossed or perhaps pointed shields demonstrates. It is clear that John viewed Gwenwynwyn as a useful buffer between himself and Gwynedd, hence his eagerness first to split Gwenwynwyn off from his northern counterpart. Llywelyn and Gwenwynwyn had seen eye to eye for a short period before Paynes Castle, and then to provide him with the incentive to win as much territory as he could for himself in Pura Walia. So what can we say about the rivalry between Gwenwynwyn and Llywelyn? And it was a rivalry, no matter how we wish to gloss it. What we find is that Gwenwynwyn was encroaching on or competing with the Prince of Gwynedd in many different ways. The first of these, and perhaps the most sinister from Llywelyn's point of view, was Gwenwynwyn's sponsorship of Meredydd ap Cynan. Meredydd ap Cynan was of the House of Gwynedd and exercised control over territory in Eifionydd. And it would appear that Gwenwynwyn took him in as a client ruler. This would have been seen as a clear challenge to Llywelyn's rights. It had happened on occasion that the rulers of one polity in Wales had overreached into the polity of another. The Lord Rhys attempted this in Meirionydd and Cyfeiliog, respectively, in the 1160s and the 1170s. But for Gwenwynwyn to do this at a time that Llywelyn ap Iorwerth was coming to prominence was a rather bold thing to do. This theory drives support, as Dr. Stevenson has pointed out, in the reference to Gwenwynwyn in poetry as Teyrnwalch Dinas Emrys, or aspiring lord of Dinas Emrys. Now, the masonry tower at Dinas Emrys lies within Eifionydd, and so it may be that Gwenwynwyn was seeking to establish his right to overlordship of Eifionydd through Meredydd ap Cynan, who eventually was ejected from his lands in 1202, and would appear, interestingly, if an early modern tradition can be believed, to have sought refuge in Gwenwynwyn's territory. We also have Gwenwynwyn using, at this time, the style Princeps Powysian and variations on that. So rather frustratingly, we don't have a definite beginning for this. He uses it in 3 different documents, only one of which can be securely dated to 1204. The others could have been issued any time between the end of the 1190s and the end of Gwenwynwyn's reign. So we do not get a good idea of chronology. But it is interesting that he does this at a time that the term rex or king is starting to lose its cachet in Wales. Now, the story behind this is well known. By the time we get to the 12th century, all kinds of minor rulers are starting to style themselves as rex or king, and therefore the very term began to get devalued in Wales. There was not one king of Wales, but many kings of various parts of Wales. And it was in response to this dilemma that Owain Gwynedd would appear to have styled himself Princeps Waliae, the Prince of Wales, or Prince of the Welsh, a variation on that, Princeps Waliarum, in the 1160s. We know this to be the case, even though no documents, I believe, survive using this, because it is found in English administrative documents. And so Princeps, from that point onwards, becomes a viable alternative for those seeking to elevate themselves above the status of petty kings in Wales. And for the purposes of today's lecture, the most important thing to remember here is that at the turn of the 13th century, only one other ruler in Wales is doing this, and that's Llywelyn, who by this time, by 1199 at the latest, has started to style himself Princeps Norwaliae, the Prince of North Wales. And we do find a couple of minor rulers in the Heibbards referring to themselves as princeps, but without the geographical appellation. So presumably that connoted a slightly lesser status. So I mentioned before that Arwisli becomes important. because one of these instances of Gwenwynwyn styling himself princeps also includes the reference to himself as Lord of Ardwistley. And this is important because what we see here is him differentiating between, as it would appear, direct rule over his territories in southern Powys and indirect rule through the exercise of overlordship in Ardwistley. This is most interesting from a point of view of what happens 20 years down the line, which is that Llywelyn ap Iorwerth styles himself differently. He round about 1230, or possibly a few years earlier, again, there's an issue with evidence, he dropped the style Princeps Nordwaliae and started to refer to himself as Prince of Aberfrau, Lord of Snowdon. So this seems to, again, differentiate between one style of rule and another style of rule. And it is interesting to speculate whether or not he took his cues from Gwenwynwyn's rather elegant resolution to the same dilemma. It would appear that he did this in order to attempt to mediate his power. There may well be the case that people in Ardwistley were a little disgruntled by the fact that they were subject to his overlordship, and so he sought to ameliorate their concerns by including this qualification. And then we come to Carreg Hoffa, a rather unprepossessing castle on the border between England and Wales, as far as we can determine. It more or less disappears from the historical record after the second decade of the 13th century. And we would not know about Gwenwynwyn's interest in it at all if it were not for the Breviate Chronicle, a version of the Britiae, in which, under the entry for 1197, it is noted that Gwenwynwyn launched an attack on northern Ceredigion, on Aberystwyth into Haybarth, and captured Griffith, a scion of the house, and then transferred him into the custody of the king in return for the possession of Carreg Hoffa. So this is an interesting occurrence, and it turns out that Carreg Hoffa was the location of a silver mine. We don't know when it was established. It first comes to prominence in the middle of the 1190s, when Owain Cyfeiliog relinquished control of it to Hubert Walter, who we mentioned earlier, the Archbishop of Canterbury. So the circumstances in England here are worth pointing out. Richard the Lionheart had been captured on crusade and was being held for ransom, and it's plain that his royal administration was having trouble stumping up the cash, as a result of which his officials, including Walter, appeared to be seeking out different revenue streams, as we would say today, one of which was the silver mine at Carreg Hoffa. It is an interesting indication of the ambiguous status of southern Powys, that his middleman was given the sum of £20 with which to purchase the mine if it was necessary. And the corollary here is that the King of England was said to own all silver mines within his territory, and so the no payment would have been possible. So this offers us an interesting test as to how Gwenwynwyn saw his relationship, or how Owain Cyfeiliog saw the relationship of southern Powys to the King of England. And interestingly, the money was never paid. So this may indeed suggest that closeness, that cleaving to Richard the Lionheart and later King John was there from a very early period. In any case, once again, what we find is that Gwenwynwyn is emulating Llywelyn ap Iorwerth in doing this. Round about the middle of the 1190s, Llywelyn regained control of the castle of Rhuddlan, and we know from other sources that Rhuddlan was the site of a mint, and that his predecessor, David I ap Owain, was responsible for minting short cross pennies there for the period of his reign. Llywelyn would appear to have continued this. Well, we know he continued this because 4 Munias are attested as having worked at Rhuddlan during the period of his reign. And so this plainly not only offered him multiple opportunities or a continuing opportunity to swell his coffers and pay for such grandiose gestures as his castle building program, it also offered a way of aggrandizement. We often talk about Hywel Dda as being the only king who ever issued Welsh coinage with that single anomalous survival of a penny properly minted for him by somebody in Mercia. It's not true. We find David ap Owain and Llywelyn ap Iorwerth both minting coins for a period of around 50 years, it would appear, in North Wales. And clearly, Gwenwynwyn wanted a slice of the action. And so once Hubert Walter realized that the mine at Carrickoffer was not as profitable as it might have seemed, he started casting around for a way to get rid of it. This is our surmise. And Gwenwynwyn decided to approach him, or Walter approached him, and their stars aligned. We can't infer from this that Gwenwynwyn minted his own coins. Aside from anything else, no such coins exist. So there's a gap in the archaeological record which doesn't really speak to that. But it would appear that what he did instead was to sell the silver mined for use at the mint at Shrewsbury. And in so doing, we can strengthen Dr. Stevenson's entirely reasonable suggestion that the lords and of Powys executed a sort of top-down effect in the gradual movement to a cash-based economy at the end of the 12th and the beginning of the 13th centuries. Gwenwynwyn reached his zenith in the first few years of the 13th century. We find him embarking on multiple incursions into Haybarth and marcher lordships, such as that of the De Brieux family. In 1202, so the British inform us, he was on the point of going to war with Llywelyn before ecclesiastics and the wise men on each side averted that possibility. And around about 1204, we find him entering into an alliance with Ranulf and Chester, which becomes important later on. It is also at this time that we see him carrying on the diplomacy with Gerald of Wales regarding the campaign for St. David's to become a metropolitan see. And it's most unfortunate that we don't really know anything about the workings of his royal government during this period. As Gerald of Wales noted in his passage, which we quoted earlier, he does seem to have taken his men into council. But whether or not this was a formal body of the sort which was inaugurated by Llywelyn ap Iorwerth and his successor, Llywelyn ap Gruffydd, later on in the 13th century, we can only speculate. We also know that he was an important patron of Strata Marcella Abbey. And if you haven't heard of this, that's entirely unsurprising. Unfortunately, it no longer exists. It's one of the many victims of Henry VIII and the dissolution in the 1530s. But it can be found just out, the remains of it, the site of it can be found just outside Welshpool, and it was subject to a geophysical survey 10 years ago, of which we see the results here. Quite a large institution, founded by Gwenwynwyn's father, Owain Cyfeiliog, in 1170, and would appear to have somewhat resembled altogether more well-known abbey at Ballycrusis in terms of its layout. But things started to sour for Gwenwynwyn in 1208. And William de Brieux, his luck had also run out by this time. We're not quite sure why he was harried and victimized, I think is not too strong a term, by King John. There's the gruesome story of how his wife and son were captured, sent to Corfe Castle, Dorset, and then starved to death. An example of King John's maleficence when it came to his opponents. Holden refers to William de Brieux as the poppy grown too high, the member of John's retinue whose power was overweening, and so King John had to cut him down to size. In any case, what happened was that there was a power vacuum caused along the Welsh border because de Brieux's lordships had been taken into royal custody. Gwenwynwyn, and it strikes me that this was the most serious misstep of his entire career, took it upon himself to occupy those lordships. John was not pleased, and so Gwenwynwyn went to parley with him at Shrewsbury, whereupon he was promptly arrested and imprisoned. The result of all this was that southern Powys was in turn overrun by Llywelyn, probably 6 to 8 weeks later. We're not quite sure of the date, and that caused problems for Llywelyn too. His lands were restored to him by John in late 1210. It's quite plain, I think, that by the time we get to the end of 1210, John had formulated the intention of invading Wales. The first invasion carried on in March was a little hurried, but not so much that it wouldn't have been successful if it wasn't for Llywelyn's tactics. He took the Welsh into the mountains, into the fastnesses, and left John to starve along the Welsh coastal route, having removed all the livestock and grain as well. But nevertheless, Gwenwynwyn stuck with him, cleaved to John, and during the second invasion of 1211, John forced Llywelyn to capitulate. But if Gwenwynwyn felt that switching to become a vassal of the King of England was a worthwhile thing to do, he was disavowed of this. John built a spate of castles in Wales and took over a number that were already existing, including the one at Mathrafal in mid Wales. And so, as a result of this, Gwenwynwyn was one of the many Welsh rulers who went over to Llywelyn's side in 1212 and assisted, or at least looked on, as Llywelyn regained his position in Gwynedd. As a result of his newfound allegiance to Llywelyn, King John deprived Gwenwynwyn of his manor at Ashford in Derbyshire, and Llywelyn was clearly also somewhat skeptical of Gwenwynwyn's motives, because he asked Gwenwynwyn for hostages and for written pledges of allegiance, which in due course Gwenwynwyn broke once again. In January 1216, he was made Lord of Montgomery by King John, and Llywelyn finally overran southern Powys for good and exiled Gwenwynwyn. He would appear to have died later that year, probably in Cheshire, under the protection of Ranulf, Earl of Chester. So, what to say about this remarkable career, volte-face after volte-face, in service of himself, as so many have suggested in the past? I think Dr. Stevenson's overall view here is a correct one, which is that Gwenwynwyn found himself caught between a rock and a hard place. And although Gerald of Wales excoriated him for his lack of support of his campaign to make St. David's a metropolitan see, he also points out that probably what was going on here was that Gwenwynwyn was anxious to placate his allies at the time, the King of England and those who were close to him, and felt that he had to refrain from offering as full support as he might have done of Gerald's position. In any case, it is long overdue that Gwenwynwyn was rehabilitated, and with the publication of Dr. Stevenson's book, I dare say we've moved quite a way along in that regard. And I'll close there. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig. So, I guess the answer to the question that you've posed, Prince, Lord, or Vassal, the answer is all three at different times and parts of his career. Because yes, it's always struck me that the key to understanding the politics of the period is that Gwenwynwyn's priority was an independent Powys, and therefore his actions were dictated by ensuring the Powys, or southern Powys, survived as an independent polity, and at times it was Gwynedd that was the greater threat to that.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I mean, independence is a sort of slippery business when we're talking about this period in history. But yes, I think in outline, he certainly wanted to maintain and indeed extend the polity which his father had begun to establish. Talking about, Arwysley and his attempt, so it would seem, to exercise overlordship in Eirionydd. And it's difficult to determine, whether or not he was on a fool's errand there. I mean, what I come back to time and again is the geography of Powys, which is really unhelpful. If you're looking to establish yourself as your own person, with Gwynedd, there are the fastnesses in the northwest, which, as we know, were extremely difficult for invaders to overcome. Many English chroniclers make reference to them. Llywelyn, this is with reference to Llywelyn ap Griffith, Pierre de Langtoft, this is, Llywelyn has caused the fastnesses of Snowdonia to be guarded so that King Edward knows not where to make an entrance. The passage is something of that sort. And Gwenwynwyn did not benefit from anything like that. And it is a strange sort of peculiarity of Welsh geography that the lines of communication run not from north to south, but from east to west. All the important valleys, run that way from England into Wales. And so he was just unfortunate in that regard. We do find Gerald of Wales making reference to like the shaggy forests of Powys, implying that it is difficult to make entry because of this. And yes, it is true that when we think of 13th century Wales, we must think of it as being far more forested or far more richly forested than it is today, with important implications for transportation and communications. But nevertheless, the fact is that he had a long border to his east, which was difficult to guard, as the princes of Wales found out in the following years.
And indeed, from one perspective, in terms of what happened in the 1280s, when Edward I brought an end to native rule, then you could argue that the policies adopted by Gwenwynwyn and his successors were ultimately validated when his successors were able to retain rule of Powys, although as marcher lords, as barons of England, rather than as princes of an independent principality.
Yes, there's a very eloquent comment made by Roger Turvey with reference to the Lord Rhys of Deheubarth in the 12th century. He writes in his biography that the Lord Rhys knew when and how to bend. I think we can say the same thing about the lords of Powys in the late 13th century. They saw which side their bread was buttered, and that's how they chose to survive. Same thing with the lords of Avan down in Glamorgan as well.
To what extent do you think the rivalry between Gwenwynwyn and Llywelyn ap Iorwerth was sort of aided and abetted by the manipulations of King John?
Well, it's a difficult question to answer just because of the paucity of evidence, but I think he would have liked it just fine if they had, if the open warfare had broken out between them. But one thing that does come across very strongly in other sources, in the Britchai, Gerald of Wales and so forth, is that there is a sense of Wales as not a polity at this time, because Llywelyn had yet to achieve ascendancy, as he did in the final sort of 25 years of his reign, but of Wales as a sort of an independent cultural unit whose rulers ought to stick together, put it that way. And obviously, as I say, sources such as Gerald of Wales are problematic because, he was his own cheerleader and, was sort of seeking to aggrandize himself. But I think that's quite plain. And certainly Wales was seen that way from without. We see that in English chroniclers' assessments and so forth. The English thought of the Welsh as a people rather than a collection of peoples. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Well, as you said, part of the difficulty is the paucity of the records. But yes, I mean, John, as we know, sort of balanced sort of power in terms of always making sure that whilst sort of promoting one person, he was promoting somebody else in order to play people off against each other.
Yeah, I agree entirely. Yes, yes. I don't know if that's the hallmark of a good ruler, but it certainly worked for him for a lengthy period.
Okay, are there any more questions? I don't know whether David would like to make a comment.
Can I come in there, Philip?
Yes, please do, David.
Thanks. First of all, just to say hi to Craig. Great to see you. And thank you so much for that. I think very balanced interpretation of the difficult career of Gwenwynwyn. It seems to me that there's a mass of little problems all the way as we thread our way through it. I think you handled that exceptionally well. I think that one of the sort of interesting features to Gwenwynwyn's career is that, quite unusually, it seems to me, from a Powysian ruler, he did have a very definite sort of broader view of his place in Wales. So many of the Powysians, including even Madog ap Meredydd, are so very focused on Powys. It's enough of a struggle to keep your head above water when confronted by your neighbours around you, England, Gwynedd, etc. Even in the case of the 12th century, the Lord Rhys, who obviously lunges into Powys on several occasions. So maybe they were constrained, but I think they're also focused rather differently. I mean, do you think it reasonable to see the Powysian rulers and in general as looking eastwards quite a lot of the time? They're looking into, for example, the Shropshire Plain, and they're saying that's ours, but by tradition that's ours. And it's very interesting that some of their fortresses tend to look over the Shropshire Plain. You can see that from places like Dinas Bran in the north, certainly to Crickheath Hill, Llech Asgar, as it's called, near to Carreg Hova, in the south. But in the case of Gwenwynwyn, he's got this relationship with Meredydd ap Cynan, which I think is real, and he's got a relationship also with Maelgwn ap Rhys in Deheubarth, where he's very much the protege Maelgwn of Gwenwynwyn. So that in a sense we can see him looking around in so many directions. The lunges into De Brea's territory, ending up at Paynes Castle, where it's very interesting. It seems to me that the casualties that we know are not Powysian. We know that Llywelyn's men suffered, and we know that a lot of the minor rulers in that region of the land between Wye and Severn got captured and so on. But Gwenwynwyn's men, Gwenwynwyn himself, I honestly wonder, I don't know what you feel about this, Craig, was he actually there at the end when the English forces arrived? I don't know what you feel about that.
Yeah, well, yes, you've gone straight to my weak point, actually. I more or less glossed over Paynes Castle, didn't I? But these are all excellent points, and I'm inclined to agree. The reason I glossed over it is because it's strange to me. I don't understand how he could have had this dreadful defeat. I forget how many. I believe one of the chronicles mentions how many.
4,000.
4,000 it was.
Yeah. 3,000
by Welsh
Llywelyns.
Yeah, by Welsh standards, that is a catastrophic defeat. That's dreadful. And yet he comes out of it, barely a scratch, smelling of roses, still exercising power and wealth and authority, all these things. And so it is very, very peculiar. But I think more broadly, you do have a point in terms of him looking eastward, whilst maintaining connections westward. And the connection which I didn't mention, of course, is Llywelyn ap Iorwerth, who has... you yourself have made the argument that there's a likelihood he was brought up at the Powysian court, perhaps in Overton or elsewhere. And so clearly Gwenwyn was quick to and eager to observe the usual traditions and practices and customs associated with the exercising of Welsh royal power. But there is this persistent emphasis on what's going on to his east as well. And I think what's particularly interesting is that we never see a sustained campaign anywhere. There's a lot of raiding, there's a lot of temporary occupations of other people's lands and such. But in these regards, at least on 2 occasions I could think of, he has contact with, as we are given to understand, the King of England, and other people complain about him and about his incursions. I think William de Brios does at one point, but that nothing seems to stick. And I do wonder if this is down to possibly a lack of resources of men and material. Perhaps he did not navigate those waters, the waters of, of sort of marcher politics as well as he might have done. It's very difficult to discern, and we are hobbled by the fact that most of the acta that he issued are lost, and the ones that do exist all refer to Strata Marcella, more or less, which are not terribly revealing when it comes to politics. But I would agree with you in outline. I think yes, there is this sort of persistent emphasis on what's going on elsewhere rather than what's going on within his kingdom. And that, I think to a certain extent, that was a done deal for him. I know that there were issues in Arwisli and perhaps in Cyfeiliog in the first decade of the 13th century, disgruntlement on the part of his subjects, as we can discern, it seems, from surviving evidence. But I would agree with you that he is remarkably aware of what's going on elsewhere and sort of fit his politics into that.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Craig.